Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross will be meeting with German auto executives today to talk about tariffs. He joins us right now ahead of that meeting. And Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Before we talk about the talks today, let's talk about the talks that the rest of the nation is still trying to figure out from this past weekend. The lead story in both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal today is about the United States tapping Robert Lighthizer to be heading these talks. They're taking this as a signal to China that this is not going to be an easy negotiation. Do you think that's the proper read?
Well, Bob Lighthizer, by statute, is the official negotiator for the U.S. on trade deals, just as he was in the U.S. Mexico-Canada deals. So I don't know why anybody would have been that surprised that he was the lead negotiator. He has been acting in that capacity. Mm-hmm. So that's not really news.
I guess the reason people are reading into it is because there have been these clear signals that the advisors surrounding the president are kind of split on their views of what should happen here. Every time you see Peter Navarro move up, people think it's more concern about how hawkish that message will be coming out. Robert Lighthizer the same. When you hear from Stephen Mnuchin or Larry Kudlow, you kind of think it's maybe a more measured approach that's going to be coming from this. Again, that's speculation. That's how everybody reads the tea leaves. And Wilbur, I've always kind of thought of you as somebody who has some serious concerns about what's happening in China and maybe comes down a little more hawkishly on things. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I don't think it's a question of hawk or dove. There are a lot of improprieties in our relationship with China. In fact, I think the sad thing about China's admission to the WTO was that the President Clinton did it on the theory that they would play by the rules, but had no real enforcement mechanism in case they didn't. Mm-hmm. That's fundamentally the problem we're trying to solve, to deal both with the current trade deficit and with the theft of intellectual property, forced technology transfers, all of those activities. I think all of us agree on those broad objectives, mm-hmm. and we shall see how serious the Chinese actually are. If they're as serious, and if they live up to what was contained in the U.S. press statement after the two presidents had their big dinner, I think things will be very, very good. But it's too early to tell how serious they are.
Those are, it's a lot of ground to cover. It's a very heavy lift to try and tackle all of those issues in the next 90 days. What's your take on where you expect we might be able to make progress and where you think we'll be in 90 days' time?
Well, first of all, the 90 days is just a date for this set of negotiations. We've been having discussions with them for a couple of years. The President has had me in China 5 times during that period, and various of us for various other times. So it isn't that these discussions just pop out of nowhere. We had sent them back in May a list of 142 items that were important to consider, and the President got what he regarded as very good assurances from President Xi that a large portion of those would be addressed and very, very quickly, plus some new things like fentanyl. As you know, fentanyl has become a huge problem for our society, and they have pledged to really crack down on it. That would be an important and highly visible breakthrough just in and of itself.
The real news, I guess, is that there is actual progress, or there are actual talks taking place. We'd heard from Larry Kudlow previously that when that list was sent back in May, it was met with silence. So I guess the answer is now there are open lines of communication and talks can potentially proceed?
Right, but the proof is in the making, and we shall see where they come out. I do believe that if they live up to the indications they had with President Trump, everybody will be very happy. What's unknown is how much of that was just 40,000-foot level talk between two presidents and how much is real at ground level.
Mr. Secretary, you famously were on CNBC and you used the aluminum can as a prop to talk about how small some of these moves really were. You talked about a couple of pennies or whatever. So that was a while back. As time has gone on and we've seen some market turbulence, now we have an inverted yield curve. We've got worries about, we used to think we were in an endless cycle, and now there are some worries about global growth here in the U.S. Depending on which side of the aisle you're on, it's funny. You either blame the Fed for going up too fast, or you blame the president for his trade policies. So my question is, did all of those little trade actions actually dampen growth in the United States, or is it just the fear about what's to come that actually hurts sentiment, in your view, or is it the Fed? What do you think happened to have us questioning, the growth theme?
Well, first of all, the economy itself is really strong. You've seen the unemployment figures, you've seen the new claims, you've seen industrial production, you've seen executive confidence, you've seen consumer confidence. Those are all very, very high. It's the press that seems more obsessed with what may lie in the future. And we've gone through
the press and
several...
investors, too.
Is it the fear of fear itself? So we went to terminal pricing on the tariffs, where we went to 25% on $500 billion or something. Is that what it was? So you're saying that supply chains or farmers or aluminum, steel prices, none of those things actually had a negative effect on the economy at this point? You don't think?
You had 3.5% growth in the most recent quarter.
Right.
Remember, under the prior administration, they said the most that we can get is the new normal. What they called new normal, I called the new dismal. 1.5 to 2. We're at 3.5%. That's about double the middle of their range. So there's nothing for people to be quarreling about. The economy is ebullient. The biggest problem we have is a lack of workers. We have 7.1 million unfilled jobs and barely 6 million unemployed people. Now, that's a problem in and of itself, and it's a problem we're trying to cure.
We don't know what the fourth quarter is going to be, though. Well, we're in next year. We're worried about that. It could be back to 2%. That, a lot of people are hoping for that as you see when they come in here. But what's the yield curve telling us? What do we see? Yeah.
Remember, when President Trump first came in, people reiterated the slow growth phenomenon. They were wrong. Then when he started getting good growth, they tried to pretend, it was just a carryover from Obama. They were wrong about that. It had to do with regulatory reform and with tax cuts. Now they're saying, you grew 3.5% last quarter, but what comes next? Maybe this, maybe that, maybe the other thing. I think instead of speculating like that, people ought to judge the Trump administration by what it does, not what they think may be some boogeyman hiding out in the future.
Mr. Secretary, yesterday the president tweeted about auto tariffs potentially coming down in China as a result of the talks over the weekend. As a result, you saw the German automaker stocks really jump on that news, I think on the idea that there will be less ferocity, less of a potential whip of a threat of auto tariffs. You're meeting with the German automakers today. What will the message be?
Well, first of all, we meet with automakers from all around the world quite regularly because we're trying to get them all to increase their production in the U.S. The German manufacturers are all operating very, very close to their U.S. capacity, and on balance, we're a big net importer of cars from Germany and parts for German cars, both from Germany, from Austria, and from Mexico. So we're trying to reduce that deficit. Our car and car part trade deficit with Germany is around $30 billion. It's almost half of our total trade deficit with Europe. So it's a very, very important component of the European situation, and autos and auto parts are a big part of the global. If we don't fix auto part trade deficit and the Chinese trade deficit, we're not going to get anywhere. They're each more or less half the total.
The Commerce Department, your Commerce Department, has reportedly been circulating some draft recommendations in terms of whether it thinks the White House should be imposing a 25% tariff on those European cars. Can you tell us anything about that right now?
Yes, the drafting of the report and the analysis that goes into it have been underway for quite a little while, and we're going through our normal interagency review process. That's a process designed to make sure that State Department, Treasury, National Security Council, all the relevant departments, agriculture, everybody has a look at the report. White House counsel and Justice Department vet it so that we make sure that it's something that can stand on its own when it becomes released. President, as you know, has said that he will not impose tariffs in autos on the Europeans as long as negotiations with them are making good progress. So the timing of this whole thing will largely be driven by what happens in negotiations. China, we don't really import very much in the way of cars, and we do import some parts. So it's a very, very complicated picture, but we're moving along at a very deliberate and very orderly pace.
What would a successful negotiation with the EU look like in terms of automakers?
Well, as I said, we have a total deficit with them of $65 billion, of which about half is from cars. So some meaningful reduction in that, hopefully mainly by increased production in the U.S. For example, they all have big programs for electric cars. It's very important to us to get a lot of the manufacturing for electric cars done in the U.S. That's one of the big objectives we have. And toward that end, we recently had the announcement from SK, very major company from Korea, that they're building a very big electric battery plant in the U.S. That's a terrific development for us because that starts the supply chain.
Mr. Secretary, just to return to a couple things that you've said. First was that, you know, so long as China goes along with the U.S. statement and the elements of that statement, everybody will be happy if those are the terms of any agreement. If everybody would be happy with that, why is there any question as to whether this will happen? What would prevent the Chinese from doing that?
Well, remember, when presidents get together, you're at a very, very high level, very broad principles of understanding. Now comes the hard part, which is translating that into a definitive agreement. It's similar to the U.S. Mexico-Canada arrangement. It took something like 18 months, which is a very short time as trade negotiations go, but it took about 18 months to work out all the details in the 2,500 or so pages. So our hope is that in the 90 days, we'll pin down real ways to implement the broad principles that were discussed and were related in the press release our government put out.
Secretary Ross, we always appreciate having you here. You've been a long-time friend of the show. There have been media reports circulated recently suggesting that you may be leaving before the end of the year. Can you tell us about any plans for that, or if you plan on staying?
No, there's no truth to that whatsoever.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Secretary Ross. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, we do appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you.